wait, no, here we go.
Thanks everyone for being here and for such a really tremendous documentary. I actually can't wait to watch it again because there was just so much in there. I thought what I would do quickly is just say one or two words about the folks who are here, and then they can introduce themselves. Oh, great. Tom's going to spotlight people when they speak. If you are here and would like to ask a question, you're welcome to do so. You can either put it in the chat and Tom will see it and either call on you or to say it out loud, or he can read it for you, or you can hit your raise your hand under reactions here on Zoom, and that will bring you to our attention, and one of us will try to call on you to ask a question. So first, I'm Beth Tremblay, queer graphic memoirist. Have my first graphic memoir came out just last fall, Look Again. And I'm thrilled to be moderating tonight. We have with us Justin Hall, the original editor of the book, No Straight Lines, producer of the film, and director of the master's program. And he can tell you more about that later if he wants to, in California. Jen Camper, who you all just saw in the show, thank you for joining us. Nicole Georges, who showed up in the film as well. There were a lot of comments about how fabulous you looked. So I hope you saw those, Nicole. And Craig Bostick, who is in the No Straight Lines book and is a longtime friend of SAW. So I thought what I would do is just ask a question. I've got a long list in case nobody else asks one, but I thought I'd sort of start with a comment that was made toward the beginning of the film, and this is for anybody, which is this notion that being able to be totally honest in the content opens up the art. And I just wondered if any of you could talk about that a little. How has that impacted your work? Yeah.
I can start if you'd like. I think that was really a quote from Howard Cruse that I think about a lot. And when he died, that was something that I wrote a obituary for him as the Comics Journal, and that was sort of the central thing that sort of captured my imagination, my sort of attention and focus, that he wrote in that initial letter to cartoonists to get submissions for a queer comics anthology. It's time to take risks in the service of truth, and that is kind of sort of verklempt. That's just really powerful, and I think it guides not only us as human beings but also as artists. And we make our best work when we can be authentic and we can be honest.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that? Yes, Jen.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
Oh, Jen, let me see if I can. I'm sorry about that. Hang on. We'll get over this hump in a second. You should be okay now.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things about comics is we create everything. We create the people, the costumes, the backgrounds, I mean, the words, the pictures. So you get to create entire worlds in this art form. And for queer people who so rarely get to see ourselves or only get to see little versions of ourselves, it's kind of exciting to have that kind of control over the media and put ourselves out there.
Yeah, there was another comment somewhere in the film about this notion of the visibility and being able to draw yourself however you want. And that I thought rang true, certainly to me, but as well, the lack of visibility, even though of course it's so different now than it was even 20 years ago, visibility and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, that was Maya Kobabe, who did the book Genderqueer, said that early on in the film, that it's one of the great, wonderful things about comics as a medium is that it's an illustrative medium, right? So you get to draw yourself however you sort of see yourself. And especially for queer people, especially if you're doing queer memoir, where you're sort of looking back to your childhood, which in many ways maybe you were presenting or being represented or being seen in ways that actually weren't authentic to you and your identity. You can draw yourself however you need to when you're doing that work as a queer memoirist later, and that's powerful.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of Bishak Sam's book's graphic memoir Spellbound, in which she represents herself, she's a trans person, as having been female from childhood, which of course she was, but she draws herself that way outwardly. It's very, very interesting to look at this exact issue in that book. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, there's Rick Worley also. He does wonderful memoir stuff, and he draws himself as a cartoon rabbit in the middle of very realistically portrayed characters, but he's this cartoon rabbit.
Terrific. So to go back, I actually had written down as well the Howard Cruse quote that you mentioned a second ago, Justin, about taking risks in the service of truth. And I kind of wanted to ask you, like, I'm sure they're there, but any specific moments where you sort of stepped back and said, now's the time where I need to take a risk in the service of truth, I guess, or visibility. And maybe you've done it a lot of times, but I'd like to hear sort of about, if you're willing to share one of those, or just wisdoms you can offer to the folks listening about those moments. How is it like to step up to the precipice of risk and take it?
I came out in my zine in high school before I said anything out loud to anybody, because it just felt like other people before me had created a space where it felt like I was just jumping in to the pack of other people that had done that in their comics and zines. And so then through a diary practice and sending it to those supportive hands and kind of trying to block out all the straight people that were like, whoa, TMI. I was ready then when it was time to do a memoir. I was like, oh my God, this is with a major publisher. I really got to take it to the wall. And I wrote about the most vulnerable things from my life that I could even think about. I just for myself, I was like, what makes you feel the most shame? And then I was like, I'm going to draw about it and just see what happens. And I kept waiting for my editors to say, let's cut this out. And they were like, no, this is making your character better and stronger. Because it's just such an intimacy immediately when you're looking at a graphic novel. You see the person's visual handwriting right away. Whereas with the prose book, it may take you a little while to figure out that intimacy. So there's something really special there.
Thanks. Yes, I love that. I hadn't thought about that. The intimacy of seeing the mark made. Yeah. Any other? Yes, Jennifer.
Jen, don't unmute. Hang on. There we go.
Okay, thanks. Well, now I forgot what I was going to say. No, I think that for me and for most cartoonists, probably our first audience is ourselves. And so we're really drawing the thing that we want to read and that we want to see. And I kind of forget that anybody else is ever going to read my comics. So often I'm just drawing what I want for myself as the first reader. And then it's kind of later that I think, oh yeah, other people will see it. But that really doesn't come into my mind when I'm drawing.
Interesting.
I think of code switching a lot, like when I'm I'm working on a graphic memoir now, and I've done other memoir stories, of course, before, but that where certainly, I've been thinking a lot about, particularly as a gay man, how I sort of code switch with people who are not gay men, and our lives can be quite different actually than the lives of the people around us. And I remember I was talking to my mom about this once, and she was like, "Well, this seems sort of dangerous what you're doing, because the whole political strategy has been to get civil rights, has been to say, actually, we're just like the rest of you, right? We want marriage, we want all these things that everybody else wants, and we're just the same as you. You got it wrong. But what you're actually saying in your work is that actually we are different." And like, you know, in my case, I'm sluttier than the average straight person. And like to sort of acknowledge that and be like, okay, what are the ways in which we are in fact different, and can we talk about that at the same time also recognize that we're all human beings deserving of rights and in society. And that's sort of a sweet spot, I think, for me with memoir.
Tom put that in the chat, just so you know.
Yeah, he did. It's
It's like
immortalized.
Justin Hall headline: sluttier than the average human being.
Average straight person, right?
The average bear.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. So the film, the subtitle of the film is The Rise of Queer Comics. And so I'm wondering, are we still in the rise, or are we in a new phase for queer comics? And what do you think about all that? And how would you characterize kind of where we are now with in the context of storytelling in comics and also just sort of social changes in our country? I'm just curious what y'all think.
I muted my, okay, I'll stay unmuted. You know, I think any fight for civil rights is always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So, you know, the more we get visible and the more we have civil rights, then there's always this backlash, which we're definitely seeing now. And so that, you know, there's never an end to our vigilance. We are always going to be under attack, and the attacks are going to change and the people may be different. But I think, you know, we all have a lot to say in comics and a lot of stories to tell, and the gatekeepers in comics are changing. So the kinds of stories that we're getting out there are new and different. And I think that's really exciting. And then at the same time, the technology is always changing. And so the format of comics, or how comics get from the cartoonist to the reader, that's always going to be changing. So I think it's exciting. And I think that there's always going to be a handful of kids that are still, you know, using photocopies and staples and putting together their own handmade zines. But then there's other people who have, you know, the latest technology, and all of it is good.
I do think that one of the differences sort of generationally now is that, you know, the early stages of queer comics, you know, you think about Mary Wings creating Come Out Comics in 1973 in the basement of a radical women's karate cooperative, which is such a perfect image. But you know, she had never heard the word lesbian until she was 19. And she thought she was the only person in the world like her. And so for her making that comic, it was sort of a cry out into the ether, sort of like, I exist, you know. And those kind of comics are still being made, especially with you know, trans identities and sort of and then identities that are sort of being more understood within this the panoply of queer identities, like asexuality and such. And so a lot of that stuff is still an important part of it. But what I'm seeing now is also a lot of querying genres, sort of like, okay, we've done a lot of the work of saying, hey, we exist. And the slice of life stuff and the memoir stuff that sort of really pushes that forward. But now saying, okay, well, we can exist in space. we can exist in like a fantasy world, right? Like you can have queer characters and queer themes in all sorts of stories and all sorts of genres, and that's exciting to go beyond that first primal scream of, hey, we exist, to then, well, how do we exist and where, and get more complex with that.
And I just want to add the thing that I'm most excited about, and I feel very privileged to be here when we can do this, is to have gay villains. We can now create gay villain characters that aren't evil because they're gay. They're just one of the many gay people in your story, and some are good, some are bad, some are complicated. That is a huge privilege. You know, when we first started out, there were so few gay characters that every character had to be this perfect, idealized person. And now we have the luxury, which not everybody does, but here in America, we have the luxury of having complicated flawed gay characters, which are so much more fun to write and draw.
Awesome.
Great. Tom, do we have any questions in the chat? I'll just pause there
There's
before.
one recent one from Arthur. You can take that.
Great. Arthur, shall I read it or does Arthur want to speak it?
Might be complicated to get
Oh,
people.
because of the muting?
Yeah.
All right, I'll read it. This is from Arthur in the chat, and he says, I'll just read his comment. I'm of an older age and grew up in the closet. Then AIDS happened. So even though I've been writing and making art that's homoerotic my whole life, I never shared it till now. And now I'm stuck in the, where do I send this stuff so people will see it? So that's his question. Where do we send this stuff? How do we get our queer comics out into the world? Great question. Thank you, Arthur.
I mean, I think, you know, there's two places to start, and that's self-publishing and the internet. And then from there, you sort of grow, you build your own audience. And then after you've kind of built an audience of your own, you can go to a publisher and say, hey, look, I have this audience, and find other people who are doing work like yours and where are they being published. And ultimately, if you can't find a publisher, just self-publish or create your own anthology. I mean, that's what we did so many times. You know, you have to make your own way through the world, and community is really important. So reach out to the other cartoonists who are doing work similar to you, and you know, share information.
I love telling students once they have self-published to start gifting their comic to people whose comics they love. Like show
great.
up to a comic convention that you hear about and just have copies in your backpack and go up to Jennifer Camper and be like, I love your comics. I saw you in the documentary. It's at this thing. I just want you to have this. No strings attached, but I just wanted you to have this. Just like, and then you can write someone a nice letter, just write a fan letter, send your comic, get in their mind. So then they remember you, and then they'll see the next time there's an opportunity. And if you fit, maybe they'll reach out to you.
Terrific. Thanks. That's great advice. Plus, there's something behind that, the generosity of spirit, I guess, that is sweet. And I don't mean that in I just love the open-heartedness of that. Yeah.
Do you have another question, Beth? I could read it actually.
Okay, great.
From Tam, they say, read it for me. What are your thoughts on the banning of books with any queer content whatsoever? Trying to make it a felony for librarians, et cetera. So who wants to talk about book banning?
Well, it's, you know, it's the most counterproductive thing you could ever do. If you tell a kid not to read a book, they're going to go find that book, and kids can find anything on the internet. You know, most of the banned books sales skyrocketed. They got attention, they got written up. So, you know, my attitude is, how stupid are these conservatives to think that trying to ban a book is ever going to work? I mean, there's queers in the Bible. Are you going to ban the Bible? I just, you know, it's ridiculous.
That does come with some risks, you know, though I do, you know, Maya Kobe was in the film and was one of our students. You know, E's book, or Air book, Genderqueer is the most banned book in America right now, and certainly contributed to the sales of that book. But at the same time, you know, it's I do worry about their safety, you know, at a convention, or, you know, who knows, right? So, and also, you know, those books then get pulled from libraries, school libraries, where the most disadvantaged kids, maybe with the least resources, really needed to have it there. So there are dangers associated with it, but I agree with Jen. Like, I mean, ultimately, it's shining a spotlight on that book, and you know, ultimately, we're going to win the culture wars. Like, we're better. So better than those people. So you know, like, it's, and our books are more fabulous. Let's just face it. So so I'm, you know, you take this with a grain of salt, because my husband says I have a serotonin imbalance. I'm too optimistic and happy. But you know, I do think that this is sort of a last gasp of, like, real repression and oppression, and that the direction that we're going, which is more inclusivity and a greater allowance for different kinds of stories, will continue.
Yeah, and I'll just add that the target is changing. You know, I mean, it used to be just being queer was bad, and you know, anything gay. Now, you know, with gay marriage, I mean, if you're a rich white gay man, it's kind of acceptable. But you know, now they're going after trans kids or trans people or whatever. So I mean, what we have to keep in mind is the target will keep changing, and those of us who do have privilege and civil rights, or some privilege and civil rights, need to be vigilant for those who are still getting trashed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great, thanks.
I'm curious, if I may, Craig, I was just thinking about your like really beautiful sort of poetic pieces, the sort of one-pagers with the sort of rock and roll ones. We pulled some of those images in the film. How do you look back on that work? Do you think I'm curious about your thoughts about that work now.
I mean, I still like that work. And I was thinking about, because Jennifer was talking about creating something for yourself, which was definitely what I was doing. Those were the first comics I ever made, just like those one-page things. And I sent them to David Kelly because I liked his work. And that's how I ended up in Boy Trouble. Just so that's the way I got published.
Those were your first pieces? Wow.
Yeah, I never made comics before. And I made one of those and sent it to David.
It's funny how so many of us met each other through the work. Like, I think I saw, you know, many of you, I saw your comics first, and then I got to know you later. And that's just another, you know, reason why it's so important to get your work out there, even if it's just a zine or something on social media.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I met David and Robert, through the mail. And, you know, they wanted to put my work in their anthologies.
That I had a question.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh yeah, no, that's fantastic. Yeah.
I had a question related to that, if you guys don't mind me jumping in, and it's a simple one, but I'd love to hear, and forgive me if this was addressed in the film by anybody, but I'd love to hear what the first instance where you realized, oh, I could tell my story. I could do it this way, whether it was comics or not. Maybe you saw it in another medium, or maybe you saw it in comics. But when was what was the first thing that made you realize, like, oh, I can do this? I'd love to hear from all four of you if I can.
I got a really poorly done ska zine by a straight man, and I was like, oh my God, this is so dumb and boring and ugly. I could do this. I could get all these dollar bills. And then I didn't think I could draw comics because I still thought that was either like Peanuts or Marvel, and I just had tried both and just didn't feel right. But then I found The Assassin and the Whiner by Carrie McNinch, and I found King Cat by John Porcellino, and my sister had Hothead Paisan in her apartment, which the drawing in that I was like, whoa, I could never draw this good. But those things really help, like John Porcellino and Carrie McNinch. I feel like that kind of era of self-published diary comics made me realize, I was like, oh my God, you can just draw your own life. This is, and it doesn't have to look like anything. It can be simple and beautiful and effective. And so then I thought I would try.
Thanks. Any of the others?
I was going to say, I mean, I was read comics for a long time, but then when I discovered alternative comics like Love and Rockets and Linda Berry, that was kind of what made me think I could do comics like that.
Yeah, Love and Rockets was sort of the turning point for me too. Like, I mean, I always loved reading comics and was really invested in comics, but when I read Love and Rockets and seeing the queer characters, they're also portrayed so authentically and just so, you know, matter-of-factly, and in complex ways that weren't, you know, They weren't flat by any means. I was like, oh, right, okay. And I remember I was doing the posters for the GLBT group on my campus at SUNY Purchase, where I was going to college, and I just used Maggie and Hopi for every one of the posters. And eventually people were like, why are these two punk lesbians on every single poster for our group? I was like, but they're Maggie and Hopi. They have to be in every single thing I put forward. But that was sort of, reading Love and Rockets made me realize that you could really make comics about whatever you needed to be making comics about.
Awesome. And Jen, did you answer that?
Yeah, ever since I was a kid, I always wrote stories and drew pictures, and comics just let me do both at the same time. So I never doubted that I could do it. I just did it. I didn't care what anybody thought. But having Howard Cruse as my first editor and mentor really changed, my whole sense of, I can up my game. I mean, he really made me want to do much better. And he also opened up doors for all of us with the gay comics anthology comic. And then just, having him as an editor to catch my misspellings or, ask, well, how about this scene? That just changed everything for me.
Awesome. Thanks for answering those. Beth, we have some in the chat. Do you see them from Dara?
I do, thanks. Yeah, I'll take them in order quick. Dara has asked, are you folks seeing a blend of prose and comics emerging, or other sorts of hybrid works emerging in this kind of expanding queer comics world? And if so, like, what are you seeing? What's catching your attention?
Well, I'm seeing all kinds of new ways to use words and pictures. Just off the top of my head, Emerald Ferris's My Favorite Thing Is Monsters is just, a really new way to use words and pictures as a storytelling device. And if any of you haven't seen her work, it's printed on this lined paper, so it looks like somebody's notebook, and it's words and pictures, and it's comics format, and it's, other kinds of formats. And then, with technology, people are doing really cool things online. Somewhere you don't even have panels, you just scroll through the image and it just is like a scene that usually goes up and down, and it just keeps going and going. And there's this new thing. Have you guys seen this all, where you pinch and you expand? And so you're looking at a person who's holding a mirror, and then you expand on the screen and you go into the mirror, and there's a picture of a lake, and then you expand, and on the lake is a person in a boat, and you keep expanding the screen. I forget the name of the software, but that sounds really fun to play with. There's 3D software now where you can walk on the screen, you can walk into a room and look in windows and see, and again, it's comics, but in this new format. The sky's the limit. I mean, anything you can imagine is possible. And I just think it's great.
Yeah.
I wish I had time to play with all these new technologies.
There is a sort of interesting question about when does the technology, when does the form change and not become comics, because the form is as much defined by what it doesn't do as by what it does. And I've always thought of comics as sort of, a language about on a static page, as an allegorical language about time and space. And at some point that gets complicated by the static page moving in some way, right? Like a screen or becoming interactive. So, at some point we may need to create new terms for these sort of hybrid forms, but they are using comics language and comics theory to and the text image relationships and panel transitions in some way, or image to image sequences to create story. And so that's continues to be at the center of it.
Yeah, agreed. Beth, you want to ask that question from Margaret?
Yeah. So Margaret has asked, and I was thinking the same thing myself earlier. I'm so glad she asked it. So she says, many early queer comics are out of print or hard to access. So what can or should we be doing about getting these comics back into print or making them available to a new generation, in addition to the No Straight Lines collection?
Well, that's something that I'm very concerned with, and I hope that on top of all my other projects, I have a list of cartoonists I want to try and get back in print. So that I agree, we need to do that. And what we can all do is, talk to publishers and say, hey, we want this stuff reprinted. And a lot of us in the industry are at work trying to make it happen. It's sometimes very complicated and there's a lot of moving parts, but if the pressure is there, it'll happen.
I think we also have help now, right? Because we have scholars like, I believe Margaret Galvan is on this call or on this Zoom, for example, who's been doing great work in Florida, in the University of Florida, archiving and analyzing, especially a lot of the Dykes zines and mini comics from the 90s, and having scholars sort of digging into this material is really, really important, and having archives like the LGBT Historical Society here in San Francisco, the James Hornell Center in the San Francisco Public Library, people like Karen Green over at Columbia, who has Howard Cruse's papers. People, I think it's not just for a long time, I think the history of comics and sort of comics archiving have only been in the hands of cartoonists because no one took our form seriously, and that's not true anymore. So, which is wonderful. So we can sit back and like let the academics do a lot of the work that they've been doing. I have my toe in that world as well from making lines and trying to archive some of this stuff, but there are people who are much better trained than I am in this sort of work, and it's really wonderful to see them stepping up.
Great. Other thoughts on that? It's good to know that if we just need to, we can ask for it maybe and help put the pressure on. That's terrific.
Well, I think out of the people, 38 people here, I think at least 4 of you could start an imprint at some point, right? A lot of you care about comics, you're working in comics, maybe someday you get a job as an editor, you move your way up, or you get a windfall. Some of you are secretly rich. Start an imprint, start a small publishing thing. You don't have to publish someone's entire life's work. You could republish a zine that you like that came out in the 70s or something. You could write to the person who might be still alive and say, hey, can I take you to brunch? Or, hey, here's a letter. Can I republish your zine, 100 copies of your zine, and then see what happens? That 100, or you could do crowdfund. It's really like you can take the DIY idea and bring it to this thing you want to do. Like before Fantagraphics, when I was at Center for Cartoon Studies as the fellow, Steve Bissett at some point he threw all the 70s women's feminist comics at the students, and he let me take home a stack this big. And I was like, now I have to dedicate my life to putting out Trina Robbins' work and the work of these 70s comic artists. And then Fantagraphics did it. Yeah. They put out a giant volume of women's comics from the 70s and 80s. Whew. But if that hadn't happened, I took Trina to breakfast. I flew to San Francisco and I was like, you don't know me. I would like to help with this project. And she's like, oh, they're already doing it. And I was like, oh my God. But you can make it a DIY thing. They may say yes, they may say no, but give it a try.
You can only ask, right? Exactly. Great. Thank you. That's a great idea. I had not thought of that myself, the DIYing, bringing somebody else's voice back. Yeah. The next questions from Scripter B is, do you have any recommendations for new upcoming queer cartoonists to watch out for?
All
Just
of my
general
students.
advice?
Was that, Nicole?
Just general advice?
No, I think they're looking for recommendations. Young cartoonists who've caught your attention and who you would recommend. I think that's how I'm understanding the question.
A lot of our students. I mean, I would say, I'm sure at SAW and certainly at CCA, our MFA and comics program is rife with queer folk. So, and they're making great work, like incredible, wonderful work. So, I am bullish on the future of queer comics for sure. I think we're going to see a lot more. And it's really kind of amazing. One of the things I'm thinking about with the documentary and sort of and the No Straight Lines book was how marginalized, and certainly Jen can talk to this, how marginalized queer comics were, sort of in a parallel universe from the rest of the comics world, right? They were, because they weren't allowed in comic book stores, they weren't allowed in bookstores, they weren't published by mainstream publishers, so they were all sort of within this insular world of queer media. They were published by queer publishers. They were only sold in gay and feminist bookstores, serialized in queer newspapers, and that allowed for all this freedom of expression, which was quite remarkable, and the scene to develop, where it was an uncensored window into queer lives and experiences, and an uncensored window sort of into this, made by queer people for queer people. But now, that queer media world has mostly fallen apart, and queer voices are now increasingly actually being centered in the comics industry and beyond. Like, you're seeing a lot of the book publishers, publishing queer graphic novels, and it's a really exciting time. I do worry about some of the more marginalized voices, or the sort of the edgier voices that, the Hada Paisan homicidal lesbian terrorist is never going to be published by Houghton Mifflin. So I worry about the loss of those kinds of voices, but it's exciting to see the stuff that's happening.
I just want to put a shout out for people who are looking for cartoonists. Mari Naomi, who's a cartoonist, has created databases for queer cartoonists, cartoonists of color, and cartoonists with disabilities. And if you go online, there's lists and lists and lists of wonderful people doing wonderful work.
Mm-hmm. I really like our former student, Will Betke Brunswick, just put out a book called A Pros and Cons Lists of Strong Feelings with Tin House. The artist Soul, or JB Brager, you can follow on Instagram, is working on a graphic memoir as we speak. Several of my students are working on queer graphic memoirs as we speak. I'm trying to think of who else off the top of my head. I'll get back to you. I'll start typing soon.
We'll post it in the comments tomorrow.
Sure. So what do you folks think queer comics have to offer to non-queer readers, as it's showing up more and more in mainstream places? One of the things I love to talk with people about is a phrase I stole from a book written a long time ago about gifted by otherness. And what are some of the things that, and there's other kinds of otherness, of course. We talked about intersectionality. It came up a little bit in the documentary as well. But like, what are some of the things that you think queer comics and specifically have to offer non-queer readers?
I mean, I would say a sense of authenticity, right? Like, I mean, the fact you have to sort of battle that you're putting forward stories that have been suppressed for so long, and oftentimes the storytelling is an act of survival in some way. It has been an act of survival. So there is an intensity and authenticity to that expression that can be very exciting and inspiring, I think, for all different kinds of people. I think there's a curious alchemy where, if you try to make work that's accessible for everybody and sort of universal, it oftentimes winds up feeling really flat and boring. Whereas if you make work that is very specific to your experience and has that authenticity to it and is very idiosyncratic and individual, that's actually the work that ends up being the most inspiring and the most interesting to people who have different life experiences. I know that as a reader, I am constantly fascinated by stories that are beyond my experience, because I want to know about more people in the world, and that's interesting to me. I want to see the stuff reflected back at me that's similar to me, of course, but I also want to see things that are quite different from me. So I think that that brings value to non-queer readerships, and also provokes empathy, right? We want, ultimately that's a sort of a power of narrative, is that we can create empathy beyond our own identities.
You're also going to get better stories, or at least newer stories. We've already had a lot of cis het white boy tales. Open up your world and start, experiencing the viewpoint and perspectives and imaginations of other people, and And how exciting to have something new that you've never thought of before, never, even experienced. To me, that's what I'm always looking for in the arts.
Nice. Beth, we've definitely got some things going on in the chat, but I'm not sure if they're questions exactly. Are you taking a look or?
I have to scroll back. I do see that, I know there was something earlier than this, but Susanna has written, interested in advice for non-queer artists who are writing about disability in quirky apocalyptic ways. That's what it says.
Well, I think, that's one of the beauties of comics is you can describe experiences in a lot of non-traditional ways. And if your experiences are emotional or physical or whatever that are different from the mainstream, comics are a really great way to do that. You're using words and pictures. I'm doing a comic now has a lot to do with smells. And it's been really interesting to how do I draw smell and odors in this comic? And I developed this whole comics language for smell in the comic. So I think that's what's fun. And if you're at all trying to describe your unique experience, whatever it may be, you can invent new words and new pictures to describe that experience.
Wonderful.
I agree.
Great. Tom, have I missed any? Have you found any, or any folks who, if you typed a question and I missed it or we missed it, please retype it. I don't want to leave anyone out, but I'm feeling Patricia typed a question.
Patricia typed a question. Let's see if I can find it.
Yeah.
I think it might have been above.
Sorry, Patricia. Hang on, we're looking.
Maybe they.
Oh, here it is. I found it. What about using weird photo filters and apps for comics creation or AI art? Where do you folks draw the line in using that kind of thing?
Well, I don't like it unless that's the only way you have to make comics. In which case, dance to the beat of whatever drummer you can. But if you have the ability to draw, I would really like to see how things look through your lens.
Right.
I do find this a really fascinating conversation. It's very new. I think it's, it's swift changing, right? So some of the conversations around AI art remind me of my grandfather was a photographer, and his generation was sort of analogous to cartooning, where cartooning is now, where it was not really seen as a fine art form because it was just you points, a device at something, you click, and you don't, and that's not real art. So his generation was the first generation of photographers that started to get included in gallery shows and museums and treated as an art form. And I feel like that's where sort of comics are now. But AI art is, that a lot of the same arguments against AI art were against photography, are also used against collage or a sampling in hip hop music. So we've been through some of this stuff before. Not to say that there aren't genuine sort of dangers to art that scrapes from other artists, scrapes styles and imagery from other artists. But it seems to me like photography can be used as something for a number of different ways. It can be used as documentation. It can be used as sort of selfies. It can be used as an art form. Same with AI. I've seen some friends of mine making AI art that is very, to my mind, unquestionably art, and they're using it as a tool. Oftentimes creating an image with AI, then going back and drawing over it, drawing into it, then adding more to the algorithm, subtracting, and they're using it sculpturally, right? I could also see it using it for photo references. Like right now, when I need to create a scene of, if I want a character walking along, 6th Avenue in New York, well, I'm going to look up Google images of 6th Avenue in New York. But you can also use AI to sort of create that photo reference that you can draw from. So there's, it depends on how you use this stuff. And we're in the midst of a conversation developing.
I noticed that, I mean, with any of these tools, the legal aspect always is playing catch up. So recently, I think Getty is suing some AI software company because they're using the Getty images. So, we all know that someone somewhere with enough money is going to start getting pissed off that AI software is cannibalizing their images. And so eventually there'll be some kind of legal thing, just like sampling music in hip hop where you pay for the rights or, so I think it's going to be messy for a long time. But any of these tools, I think the key is don't let the tool or the technology make decisions about your art. If I look at a piece of art and I can say that was that Photoshop filter and that, Procreate brush, and if I can identify all of the stuff you've done, then you're not doing anything with it to make it just be art. And so I think it's how you use the tools. It's not what tools you use.
I just want to clarify again, whatever your abilities are, make it so that you can't just sit down and draw. Then do whatever, make comics by any means necessary.
Yeah.
Right. And that is what's coming out in the chat. I don't know if you guys are following it at all, but Patricia and one or two others are talking about disability that has made it that there is not an ability to draw. So using apps and other things to make the comics. Exactly. So, yeah.
If I can interject, if y'all haven't seen Dave Pilkey's Cat Kid Comic Club for children, these comics, nobody's nodding. So maybe you haven't seen them. They're marvelous. They're for kids. They're for like 9-year-olds. My daughter reads them, and they're basically this conversation over and over and over again. They're like, "You mean we can just like take photos of nature and write haiku, and that's a comic?" And they're like, "Sure. Like, can we just like change our dolls and like put them in the mud and take pictures and make it a comic?" And they're like, "Sure." And it's just like over like, wait, can we make bad drawings and those are comics too? And they're like, "Sure." And it's like fantastic. You guys got to read that.
Oh yeah. He did Dog Man and Captain Underpants and stuff, right? Same guy. Yeah. Okay.
He's a great supporter of just do whatever you can do. Anyway.
Jen, I remember we were having this conversation about Diane Newman, right? The sort of that one of her great geniuses was to sort of bring in as many voices as possible, and how she should be, the late great Diane Newman should be really thought of as someone who sort of smashes apart the gatekeepers.
Great.
Nice.
I think we have all the questions, at least that I've been tracking. Again, if anybody else has a question to pose, Tom, do you have any questions?
No, I just talked about Cat Kid Comic Club, and I asked a question about antecedents and things like that. And it's 12:15 here on the East Coast, so some of us are fading.
This is so far past my bedtime. Oh my! You can see my dog is passed out on the floor behind me. Well, as we wrap up, then I think it might be nice to just pause a second and see if any of our panelists have anything else you want to say. Like, dang, I was waiting for a chance to say this thing about queer comics and I didn't get a chance to. So is there anything you'd like to say before?
Well, thank you for doing this, and thank you to SAW for all that you do, the workshops and the teaching. I know how difficult it is to keep something like that going, and it's really appreciated.
Thank you for coming tonight too.
A lot. Thank you.
And it's great to see you, Craig and Nicole and Justin.
Yes.
I miss all of you.
Yeah.
I want to say somebody needs to read your story. You may not ever know who they are. You may not know them right now, but somebody needs to read your story. So if it's from a queer lens, if it's from a disability lens, Jen and I make comics from an Arab American lens. You never know who your comics are going to reach or who needs to read that. So just make your story, put it out, and that's it. Just
Great.
let it go into the universe and make comics by any means possible.
Here.
Thank you.
I'm going to remove Spotlight. I don't know what gets recorded, but I'll remove Spotlight. We'll go to gallery and call it. Oh, I see somebody from Iran here. Hi, Mohor. Other people. Wow, we've got people from all over. How wonderful. So Beth, are we signing off? Panelists?
Yeah, I think we're signing off unless anybody else has anything they need to say.
I really
Thanks.
want to thank our panelists, Justin and Jen and Craig and Nicole. Thank you so much for joining us in such short period of time.
Thank you very much for putting this on.
And thank you for the documentary. Thank you for making that film.
Yeah, really marvelous. I think we've got 3 months to stream it on PBS. Is that the story? Okay.
3 months to stream it for free, and then it goes behind a PBS paywall, and you can, if you're a PBS member, you can still access it for another, I think for like 3 years. But yeah, for free until April 23rd, so another 3 months.
And for those of us who like DVDs and things, are those available now?
That's a good question. They are available for screenings at if you a university or whatever. Like you can actually screen the uncensored version. So this has been, PBS did require a bit of censorship, as you could see with the blurs, the rainbow, which were made rainbow blurs, which is nice. But and some images had to be taken out. So if you want to see the uncensored version, there are ways to do that through other distributors.
Awesome. Thanks again so much. Beth, thanks for hosting. Thanks for a million great questions.
Beth.
Sure.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Beth.
We'll share this on
Thank you, Tom.
recording with you too, everybody. Thanks so much. Thanks. Good night,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody. Have a terrific rest of your day.
Amazing.
Tomorrow.
Bye-bye.